Hello, everyone. This is Jonathan Little for PokerNews.com. I'm here today with a hand from a $5,000 buy-in World Series of Poker event, and it folds to me in second position, under the gun +1, and I have ace-10 offsuit with about a 25 big blind stack. We have about 13,000 chips playing 250, 500 with a 75 ante, and I like to raise to 1,100, which I think is fine, but if I was playing this hand today, I would very strongly consider just folding. And the reason I would consider folding in this spot is because from early position, what's going to happen is either someone yet to act is going to call, in which case we're playing from out of position with a pretty marginal hand, or someone in the blinds is going to call correctly, getting the right pot odds, and then they're probably going to play reasonably after the flop, because after the flop, all you really need to do is just check and then put your money in when you have a good hand. So for that reason, I think I would just fold this hand if I was playing it today. Now, if you were playing at a table where you thought the players were a little bit weaker, or if you just have a tight image and want to try to exploit that by raising a bit more than you quote unquote should, then sure, feel free to open up the ace-10 offsuit. But I would be a little bit more cautious with this if I was playing this hand today. So I do raise to 1,100, which is perfectly fine. Folds around to a tight aggressive player in the cutoff who calls. And then we're going to see the flop heads up. So when you do raise from early position, you very often have a nice range advantage in general, as long as you're not going too nuts. So for that reason, on dry boards, you should very often continuation bet. And what you want to think about immediately before you even make this bet is, am I going to be willing to fire multiple barrels? Because if we bet 1,200 on this flop, as I do, 1,200 into the 3,600 pot, we are going to get called very often. And since we're going to get called very often, well, what does that mean? It means we either need to be perhaps bluffing a little bit less often, or we need to be barreling more often with some of our bluffs. And one thing that some people don't quite understand is that if you bet the flop and get called, you need to be aware of what the calling range looks like, right? If we bet 1,200 into the 3,600 pot, our opponent's calling range is very often going to be quite wide, probably just like any hand that he called with pre-flop. I mean, if he's sitting here with Queen 10 of hearts, he's going to call because he has an overcard and a gut shot. If he has Ace 6 of diamonds, he's going to call because he has a backdoor flush draw and an overcard. If he has a Jack and 8 of 5, obviously he's going to call. If he has pocket 7s, obviously he's going to call. So you're kind of stretching to find any hand that doesn't have very much equity. So for that reason, we're going to get called a lot on the flop, but that's going to set up nice turn bluffing opportunities for us. We just have to make sure that we do not bet an amount that makes it to where we can't realistically make bluffs on future streets. Also, you want to ask yourself, how does my opponent expect me to play my nut hands? In which case, you should adjust one way or the other. So say you think your opponent expects you to bet small, and then set up a river half pot bet with your nuts. Well, then you should definitely do that with at least some of your bluffs. So here I do bet 1,200. The opponent calls as expected. And now we see a 3 on the turn, a complete blank. And I decide to bet 3,000 out of my 10,600 pot, or 10,600 stack. I think I would actually prefer a little bit smaller of a bet on the turn, or a little bit larger bet. And the reason is because if I bet a little bit smaller, that's going to result in my opponent calling me with more marginal stuff. And if my opponent calls me with more marginal stuff, that's going to allow me to bluff the river confidently. And I would bluff the river if I bet a little bit smaller for sure. If I bet a little bit bigger, like let's say 4,300, and my opponent calls, well, now I'm definitely not bluffing the river because I expect my turn bet to get my opponent to fold most of his marginal stuff. So I think this 3,000 bet, unless I had some sort of a read on my opponent, which maybe I did, I think this 3,000 bet probably doesn't accomplish either of those two things because I don't know if it's going to make him fold out most of his hands, and I don't know if it's going to make him call with most of his hands. So I'm a little bit lost as to how my opponent will proceed. And when that's the case, perhaps he made some sort of a mistake along the way. And if you think about my pre-flop raise size, I couldn't really have done much different. On my flop bet size, I also couldn't have done much differently. So the spot where I definitely could have played this hand differently was to either bet smaller or bigger on the turn. And this may seem really nitpicky because it doesn't really matter if you bet 2,200 versus 3,000 or 3,000 versus 4,000. And it does, especially when you're playing shallow stacked poker. It's somewhat easy to get your bet sizes right when you are the short stack, as I was in this scenario. But if you're the deep stack and you're playing against your opponent, you definitely want to be sure that you have a very accurate idea of how many chips they have. And I'm not going to say that you need to perfectly know how many chips they have, but you should at least be like plus or minus 10 or 15%. Like if they're sitting there with a 10,000 chip stack and you think they have 15,000, well, you're going to make pretty big errors. But if you think they have 11,000 and they have 10,000, it's not that big of a deal. One thing you can do to practice counting chip stacks is you can just set up some chip stacks at your house across the kitchen table from yourself and, assign denominations to the chips and try to count them. And you'll find that with some practice, you can often be somewhat close to right. And, you can set up the chips to where they're stacked reasonably. And if someone doesn't have their chips stacked reasonably, you can ask the dealer to have the opponent stack their chips reasonably. If you sit down to a table or you're new to a table and you have never seen these, you don't know how many chips anyone has, you should definitely get up and walk around the table and see if you can get at least some sort of an accurate count. But I think you'll find that with practice, it becomes pretty easy to keep track of stack sizes. Anyway, all this is to say that I screwed up my bet size on the turn, and I'm going to make a point to not do this next time. Anyway, I did bet the 3,000, and this time the opponent folded. This has been Jonathan Little for PokerNews.com. Thank you very much for being here today.